everyone, and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players of the gigging variety. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm absolutely pumped to be here with you. And I have with me the brilliant Mr. Paul Bindig again. How are you, Paul?
I'm thrilled to be here with you again, David.
Yeah, so we're here for part two of our interview with Bobby Cressey. For those of you that listened to part one, you heard all about Bobby's great career as an organist with the San Diego Padres baseball team. In this second part, we delve a lot deeper into the other aspects of Bobby's career. So whether that be jazz, ska, his approach to playing, he tags an interesting couple of keyboard players. He has some nice tips for keyboard players. It's generally a great interview. So I hope you enjoy this part too.
So Bobby, we know you as the organ player for the San Diego Padres, but there's a lot more to your musicianship than just that. And I'd love to ask you, and mainly because I want to direct our listeners and viewers to this, about your recent-ish project, Cali Native, which is a very cool, funky organ jazz combo, which I believe you put together with a bunch of the best musicians going around in San Diego. Can you give us some insight into how that all came together and what that process was like?
Yes. I appreciate you asking me about that. There came a point where, I've settled into my career in San Diego, and it's a balance of the sports organist thing, which is really 10 to 20% of what I do, if that. But I'm well known for it, and that's fine. But hey, there's another 80% of what I do. And that 80%, a huge chunk of it is playing in loads of top 40 bands, actually just one top 40 band in San Diego, kind of the best one in town, in my opinion. It keeps us very busy. There's a lot of that kind of work around here because there's loads of conventions. And these are some of my great musical friends in San Diego. And then when I'm not doing those top 40 gigs, I'll try to fit in jazz gigs wherever I can. And I've been back down here since 2010, like I said. So it's been 12 years and met a lot of great musicians along the way. And so I love playing jazz when I get to down here. I consider myself a jazz musician. So there came a point where I had all these wonderful players that I played with in these different circles. And I played loads of different things over the years. Reggae. I like to play funky music. I like to play all kinds of music. When I aspired to be a professional musician, very early on, I said, I fell in love with the notion of being a studio musician. And when I discovered the band Toto, and I swear I'm coming back to Cali Native with all this, but this is how it came about. When I discovered kind of what Toto was all about, I remember when I first, my friend who was in his reggae band with me at the time was like, he's a drummer, and he was just a huge Jeff Porcaro nut. And he's like, dude, you have to listen to Toto. You have to listen to Toto. And I remember we were on tour. We were actually in New Zealand and playing a reggae festival. And I remember in the airport, they had a Best of Toto CD. And I bought it, and I had my Discman. This is 2003 or 4 probably. And so I listened to Toto. It was this best of album. And I listened to it in those headphones and that airplane ride, and I will never forget that experience because it was just all the great hits of theirs. And it shook me. It was like everything I wanted. Just listening to those keyboard solos and just how slick all the production was and the grooves. And my friend was right there, an expert on all of it. And he was able to, I'd look over and be like, dude, this song, I would tell him kind of some of the lyrics. He's like, oh yeah, that's Georgie Porgy. What do you do? Whatever. Oh yeah, that's Africa or whatever. And so from then on, it was a period of my life where I was seriously thinking about, okay, I really want to be a professional musician. And I love the idea of these monster players that don't show that they're monsters unless they need to. I kind of liked the idea of just being able to do anything, and the idea of being able to play something dead simple, but play it perfectly and to be just the right thing for that situation. And so that kind of led to me playing over the years, just trying to get proficient in many different styles and doing gigs in many different styles. I played a lot of reggae and ska over the years, but then also being able to play R&B, neo soul, and then straight ahead jazz. And then also playing in church. I played in church. Like I said, my parents were my first playing in Catholic church, kind of figuring out, okay, how do I play like very square and white, but in a good way, and to sort through what all of these things meant, and so that people could call on me for different things. So that's led to me being able to play in a lot of different styles and pursue that ability as a player. And there came a point. So I've done that. And my current top 40 band, you play in a good top 40 band, you get to put all of that to work. You get to play all of those different styles. And that work can be a bit gratifying because of that. Some people, they really frown on that kind of work. And I get that it can be soul sucking, but at its best, it's pretty cool to be able to nail an Earth, Wind and Fire tune and then nail a Johnny Cash tune back to back, So anyway, around 2017, I really got the urge. I was like, man, I know so many great musicians in this town, and they don't always play in the same circles with one another. I'll encounter this guy on this kind of gig. I might play with these younger cats. Part of it was generational. In my top 40 band, there's some great musicians that are older. And then in some of the jazz scene, there's some younger people, and they never get to play with each other. But I'm like, I could see these two working really well together. So I kind of approached it with this concept of like, let me write a few tunes to bring some of my favorite musicians together. And that gave me the direction, the concept. And then I had to further refine it by saying, well, how the hell I could write tunes in any style. What am I going to do? And then I settled on, well, I don't want to do a straight ahead jazz album, like just piano trio, piano quartet. I could, but that would be leaving some of the things that I love on the table. Because I like to play funky pocket-based music as well. So it ended up me thinking, okay, how about a funky organ album? And I'm a piano player much more than an organ player. And my organ chops, especially and I know I'm a stadium organist and all this, but I never had training on the pedals. I'm no Jim Alfredson when it comes to having Hammond in my blood growing up. I had to figure out what the hell all of it was about, like, much later in life, sadly. So, but I got to the point where it's like, I can walk a bass line and I can play a funky ostinato and comp a bit and write some more funky tunes that aren't dead hard, and I'll have really good players around me. And so that's what I ended up doing. And so I wrote 8 tunes in 8 different styles, and I had all of my favorite musicians in San Diego feature on different ones in ways that I knew would be good for them. So there's a couple, I won't go through every tune, but there's some really funky drummers in town. There's a couple guys, their name's Jake Nager, Zach Nager. They're both drummers. And Zach Nager played with the Gray Boy All-Stars. He's like an encyclopedia of funk grooves. So I wrote a funk tune for Zach to play on. But then this percussionist that Zach never gets to play with, he's a percussionist, very versatile A-list cat who played with Luis Miguel, who's like a world famous Mexican pop star. It's like, he'll be able to play on that funk groove, and it might be a treat for Zach, who never gets to play with this percussionist. And then this guitarist who I had just started playing with that year in a Jazz Crusaders concert that we did. I said, man, you would be great on this tune. So I started assembling it. And then there's a jazz horn section, but with voicings that were not full jazz, but not full funk. So every tune came about with me combining players, and I knew it would, the way I thought would work well, and it did work well. And then I had my drummer in my top 40 band. He's a huge rudimental drummer, came out of the military, but also happens to be a total badass of all things Latin music, Cuban music. He played with Celia Cruz. So he has an interesting bag of style. So I got to write a Tower of Power style tune with him on drums. And then I got to write a cha-cha where he got to play drums. And then I brought in some of the Latin jazz guys in town. So the whole album kind of proceeded like that. And I ended up, the danger with it would be, will this be remotely cohesive? I have a reggae tune with one of my favorite reggae drummers on the same as like an album where I have a cha-cha, I have a fusion tune. And amazingly, in my opinion, it does work.
It does.
Maybe because, okay, so I could ask you why you think it works, but I think it works because by and large, most of the musicians, the horn section is mostly the same. The concept is funky organ and horns, and it was a 5 or 6 piece horn section on every tune, recorded in 2 days in the same studio. And I think that helped with the sound and the overhaul. And I wrote all those tunes. For the most part, I wrote them all in the same month and a half. There's one tune that was like 10 years old that I brought in and reworked, but mostly it was all kind of from my brain at the same time. So I think all of those things helped to make it kind of a cohesive listen.
Yeah, it feels totally like a cohesive listen. I've listened to it a number of times, and particularly a couple of the songs I have on a playlist. It just hangs together really well because of that consistency with the horns and the overall approach. Yeah, really good stuff. And we'll absolutely link to that in the show notes. It's well worth a listen. And I don't know whether it's one extreme to the other with jazz and ska, but certainly tell us a bit about the Western Standard Time ska orchestra, because I only discovered that in the last 2 days doing research for this interview, and I love it to bits. Like it's on one of my key playlists now. It's just brilliant. But talk a little bit more about that, the approach and why that came together.
Yeah, well, that is an interesting project. My first experience, very formative experience for me, was in high school. My first real job, was in a music store that sells instruments, a mom and pop one at that, not a Guitar Center, but it was music retail in the 90s, back when you could have such a thing. It's much harder to try and do that now, but they were selling instruments and they sold loads of sheet music. And I got a job there when I was 16. And what a great thing for me, because there was loads of teachers there much older than me. I learned a lot about music from these people who have since gone on. Many people that taught there have gone on. Now they play in, their first call session musicians in LA, or they're still teaching there, but I just learned loads. I was able to pick these brains of all these musicians at this music store I worked at. But a guy who started there at the same time, he was 8 years older than me. He's one of my best friends. And he played loads of what's called traditional ska. And that's Jamaican, like the ska of the 60s. There's a band called the Scotalites, and they were the initial musicians who it was really their adaptation of R&B coming over from New Orleans over the ocean. The radio that they would get R&B rhythms, and it was kind of their interpretation of that, their own homespun version. It evolved into the traditional ska groove. And they were jazz musicians. They were all from the same boys' school in Jamaica, and the band was called the Scotalites. And they would be writing contrafacts. They would be taking like chord progressions, simple jazz chord progressions, and writing their own heads on them and changing the names. And that's traditional ska. That eventually slowed down into rock steady in the late 60s, and then became religious with reggae, but the roots of it are ska. And he was huge into it. And he was 8 years older than me, and he's needed a piano player for his various aspirations and projects. And he saw me as like a young guy, I'm sure very, very green, but maybe malleable enough to like, hey, if you got a little bit of ska, he kind of plays jazz, and he's a kid, so he'll do whatever, we started this band called Full Spectrum, which was a ska jazz band. It's the early 2000s. And I was 18, 19 years old. And we recorded a couple albums, and it was cool. It was jazz and ska, kind of. Ska had always been jazzy, but this is where, in a different way, they'd have simple chord progressions, but they'd take solos. Well, now we were making the chords a bit thicker, and that hadn't really been done. And so we were taking tunes like Red Clay and playing them in a jazz style. And so I had a couple of years of doing that with this band Full Spectrum. It was a pretty horrible band to watch live, though, even though there would be like pretty good musicians in it. It was like kind of the worst of both worlds in terms of presentation, where you had like jazz musicians with no visual energy, but the music was a little bit less boring than jazz, or a little bit more boring in a sense. We were playing venues that weren't jazz venues, so it'd be like at a bar, but we're playing ska jazz. So that band didn't really go anywhere, but it did set the ground for what became Western Standard Time, where my friend Eitan, it's definitely more his vision than mine, but since I was his piano player, I was in on the ground floor of it, where it's like, okay, well, let's take ska and let's make it a big band. And so we're not going to have just like 2-3 horns, we're going to have really good arrangements, a big band, so we can kick ass in that sense. And a big band has more of a visual impact right away, and also will involve some of the best singers in the ska scene who have loads of energy. And these are guys like, there's a guy named Jesse from the Agrolites. It's a very famous ska band. And then there's Greg Lee from a band called Hepcat. That's another famous ska band. And those guys can really perform. And so that allowed the musicians to just, play the charts. And we also got our look together a bit more. And so that's what happened. It was 2011, I think, where we recorded our first album. And a really good friend of ours who from the music store, his name was Benny Golbin. And he had a pretty brilliant ear. He did all these incredible arrangements. Sadly, Benny passed away a few years ago in a car accident, but he did these incredible arrangements for the first couple Western Standard Time albums. And it was a lot of fun and we were all a bit more mature, it's like, I think we understood what didn't work with that initial go around with the small band, and we made it better for this. And so it's a ass kicking big band sound, but with ska, which hadn't really been done before, I don't think. Now, there's a band called Tokyo Ska Paradise Orchestra, which did something cool like that, but this was its own thing, and there's a lot of heavy names in this big band, and so the project continues to this day.
Yeah, I was going to say, and not that Spotify should ever be a barometer of success for any musician, but it's obvious that you've got a following there, because looking at the stream numbers on those albums, they're pretty significant. Yeah,
there's an international scene for ska for sure. As music, it's a strange scene. Like, well, lots of things have this. There's like a scene for everything, man, and you may not know about it as a musician. I'm always finding this in San Diego. Like, I'll play years gigs with certain people, and then maybe one day I'll meet someone and find out there's this whole other scene of musicians, the people that I don't know about, doing their thing. Certainly, ska has its own. There's people who are hardcore about it, and they dress like the mods. And there was this whole ska in the UK in the 70s and 80s, and so some of that fashion is part of it as well. And so this band does very well with those crowds. Now, I'll be honest, I don't want to take more credit than I should for Western Standard Time. I'm on the albums, and I'm certainly Dayton. He was in my wedding. He's one of my great friends, longtime friends. But I don't make all of those gigs now for lots of different reasons. Sometimes I have to do my wedding gigs that pay 5 times as much, or they'll be going on tour, and it makes more sense to pick up musicians where they're going instead. But I do love playing that music, and it's a thrill, man. When we have all of the best players doing it, it's really cool to be like, hey, man, like, it's cool that this is one thing in my toolkit. Not everybody can do this. It's not that hard to me, but just knowing what's appropriate and what not, and how jazzy to make it. It's like there's a certain recipe that not everybody can do. So it's kind of satisfying. Like, man, this is really grooving, So it's fun to have that project for sure.
Oh yeah, it must add so much, just the diversity of it with everything else you're doing, but also playing with killer musicians and working on something that it sounds good and is striking a chord with people. It's got to be uplifting, right?
It is, especially for me. I don't know what kind of gigs you guys do day in, day out with music and that, but when I say I've really fallen into the top 40 scene, I play so many weddings and corporate events, and it's very easy to like get burned out with. There's lots of aspects of that are wonderful, and there's a lot that can really burn you out. But one of the things that you really miss, that sometimes you don't realize until you do a gig like a Western Standard Time, is when the audience is there to see you and they're there to watch you perform and enjoy you as like as an artist. So it's amazing. You can play so much music and make a career doing it, but not get to experience that visceral thrill of connecting with an audience who's there to hear your stuff, So it's a good dose of that. And to get to go play in a bar where there's young, sexy people drinking. And it's funny, that might sound very silly for me to say that, but I swear to you, it's a very real thing to play for an energetic audience like that, as opposed to just a bunch of, I don't want to say geezers, but or I don't want to say wallpaper, but it can be wallpaper at its worst, but just where you're not the main attraction, or you're really just you're a commodity, you're a business, doing these top 40 gigs. And so it's nice it fills that cup, and the baseball games, that's a different, the baseball organ thing that doesn't 100% scratch that itch either. That's a whole different thing as well. Yeah. And that's fun, but to actually get to connect with an audience, with a cool band, there's nothing like it,
Well, and I think on that somewhat philosophical note, this is a great time for me to ask you one of the questions that we love to ask all our guests, Bobby, which is, what are some lessons you would pass on to other keyboard players, no matter what they're doing, but based on what you've learned over the journey with the diverse music you've played and are still playing?
Well, I don't know if I'm in a position to give advice to anyone, but I've found that you've got to balance making a career with staying sane, and also that there's different seasons to different parts of your career, and it's like you've got to balance. This is not new information, but you have to balance your making money and selling your soul with having fun and saying yes to things that are going to satisfy your soul and scratch a different kind of itch. So and if it gets out of whack, you can find yourself either poor or burned out. But also that sometimes you may go through seasons where you're just not in the mood for something as much, but that doesn't mean that it's like the end of the world. And sometimes that's just beyond you. I guess to zoom out and have a bigger picture, I've found, like you may, and also ways, you also want to try and find ways to keep it interesting. So like I might have a $600 wedding gig. Okay. Great paying gig. And then the next day I might've been asked to do $100 bar gig, like a duo thing. And, I might've said yes at the time. And then I might've been just like leading up to it being like, why the hell did I say yes to that stupid $100 gig? And really kind of have it bum me out during the day, because then it's like, oh, of course, if now my wife wants to do something and now she's vibing me for not being able to hang with her on this Sunday night when I'm going to go do this duo gig or something. And then I'll work it up to the point where I'm really not looking forward to this gig. Dang it. And you're just hoping it gets canceled or something. Those gigs always end up being the ones that are really fun. The more I dread a gig or I'm just not looking forward to it, it like ends up being fun. And I'll always rediscover something that makes it fun about it and makes it like affirming for myself. Like we have loads of fun singing a goofy tune or trying something that the singer's never done before. Oh, they've never sung this Michael Jackson tune. And it would be silly to just play it on a piano and have a singer sing it. But that's why we should do it. And then it goes great. And we might F up a little bit, but then we had so much fun doing it. It's like, that was maybe the highlight of my life, my musical week, So I guess it's like, that's balancing out, trying new things and never getting stale. Finding new ways to challenge yourself and make old things new. If you're in a situation where you find yourself doing the same things over and over. I've just, with the top 40 gigs that I do, like they can get quite stale, but recently I've been trying to find new ways, whether it's with constantly tweaking patches or trying to add, maybe I could add this element to the way I play it. Also, I've recently started recording our sets as well, and that's put me on edge in a good way. And now it's like, even the most inane tune that we're playing, the most simple thing, I find myself concentrating more because I'm trying to now I'm pretending that I'm in the studio and like, okay, this C major triad that I have to play on this downbeat, it's going to feel perfect because I'm putting way more mental energy into, I'm listening to the drummer and listening to the bass player. I'm just going to put it in the perfect place in the beat. This fill that I'm going to play, it's going to be a perfect fill. It's going to be 3 notes. It's not going to be 7 notes because I'm in a fuck it attitude. Or no, it's going to be, I'm going to play the perfect studio fill. I'm going to be just like gosh, like Greg Fillingane's playing the perfect thing. And so recording myself have introduced this accountability and put me on edge. All of a sudden, I'm enjoying the gigs way more again. So I found a way to make them new. So, and challenge myself. So I think that if you can always mix that in, mix in something new, mix in unexpected gigs, the chewing gum will never lose its flavor.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think that what comes through for me listening to your talk, it's bringing that passion to what you do. So thank you for sharing that, Bobby. Another question we love to ask all our guests is, do you have a story of a technical or musical train wreck that may have happened to you while playing live? What have you got for us?
Oh, man. I've been fortunate. I've not had too many technical train wrecks. I've had plenty of technical issues, but I've still resisted main stage. So when I do these top 40 gigs, I'm still Mr. Rompler. I have a CP4 and then I have a montage. So it's like an all Yamaha gig. If I'm fancy, I'll bring my SK2, but for more legit organ sounds. But just with those two, like I can get the job done. And having those two as opposed to a computer, like they never crash. So I've insulated myself from the real heinous technical stuff by doing that. Although going back to what we just talked about, I actually really want to start exploring a main stage rig, really just to challenge myself. And I listened to your Steve Porcaro pod recently, and he was talking about how he just used main stage on all those Toto gigs of the past decade. And I was like, shit, well, if it's good enough for Steve Porcaro, then it's good enough for me, you know? But anyway, so technically, you know, it's funny though, one thing that's started happening recently on my bottom CP4, and I've not had time to, because it's a nagging thing, and then when I fix it, I forget about it till the next time. Every time I power it on, the board's transposed up a half step. So yeah, every time. So the little red transpose button will be lit. I don't know what has happened to make that happen. I don't know if it's like something got saved for it to do that, or if there's more of a like glitch and it needs a reset. And I could spend 10 minutes to get to the bottom of it. You know, like I'm sure that if I reset it, save my patches, then reloaded it, it would be fine. But I'm always forgetting, and the second I fix it, I forget about it. So there's been many times where I've started a tune and it's just the most heinous cacophony. And it's almost like a visceral, like almost like pain, like you got shocked with electricity when you go, because the second you play it, you realize like, oh, and it's humiliating as well, man. Because and a lot of times it'll be on sound check. Thank God, sound check and not the actual gig. But you know, we like to roll in, and it's fun because like when we sound check my top 40 band's a very efficient sound check band, like it's fast, and what's a good band. So whenever we sound check in the venue, there's always that moment where you're first making sound that it will turn heads. Like all of the people working there, the coordinator will be like, damn, this band sounds good. And so over the past couple months, it's happened like 15 times where I'm like ready, like, yeah, we're going to show these guys, man, this is a badass. We're going to launch into this tune too. Ba-doom, drum fill. First notes, just horrible, crappy, nasty sound. And like I said, I'm jumping like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And then sure enough, bang, bang. And then the bashful look from me. Sometimes I pretend it wasn't me.
I was going to say, at least you're not arguing, because that happened to me on Saturday night, Bobby, where that happened and we hadn't had a chance to do sound check. So it was the opening song, but the bass player fell into key with me. So I was arguing with the guitar player that it was him, not me, because me and the bass player were fine, but the bass player had actually just matched me, not realizing he'd transposed as well.
So you were able to gaslight the guitar.
Yeah, so we stopped and started again. Yeah.
See, that's a bad idea, man. Like that's I don't know. That could lead to chemistry issues down the road. I was right when you were wrong. Yeah. I just like to pretend like if I start playing normal, I like to just have a blank expression as if everybody who heard it, maybe they're questioning themselves. Maybe I didn't hear that. Maybe nothing bad actually did happen, you know? So that's been obnoxious. But I do actually have a performance story as well. And it's shaped my whole career and approach to music. It was when I was like 17 and I was doing a recital. And this was a very defining moment for me where I had to play Claire de Lune at this recital. And I practiced the hell out of it. but I was nervous. But I still practiced the hell out of it. And I didn't have a grand piano. I went to my friend's in high school, and he had a grand piano, and I practiced it there. So I practiced it a ton. And I did it for I played it for, it was for my, like, they call it certificate of merit. It's like the exam, the graded exams kind of that you go through as a musician. And so I did it, and I did great on my certificate of merit. And they said, okay, we wanted you to come back and do like the kind of the best of the best recital concert. And so I practiced the hell out of it again, but I was so nervous at I go to play Claire de Lune, and I started, but then of course in the middle, I don't know where it happened, but I went off the rails. And I had this moment where, like, I was shaking so bad from nerves the whole time, but I had held it together. But then very quickly, eventually, I didn't hold it together, and I was in a whole nother universe mentally. And it was like this humiliating thing. And I had to, like, borrow from my knowledge of improvisation to kind of, like, somewhat land the song in the right key or something. I don't know how I did it, but it was like clear, humiliating meltdown. And I remember how that nervous energy, I couldn't control my fingers. It was so much, not to the point of blacking out, but I had no neurological real control to settle in with I had panicked, like big time panicked, you know? So I learned something about myself that day. And that's that I'm not cut out to be a professional classical musician. And I love classical music. Like, it kind of is my first love. I love jazz a lot, but I love classical music. And I've realized that day, it's like, that's not who I am. I'm not cut out to be. And then I would see people playing concertos and think, how could they ever do it? You know? And it's so strange because there's loads of tunes that I play in my band that I have memorized. I have lots of really complicated things memorized, but it's something about playing with your friends where they have your back, and you make one mistake and then it's not as big a deal, and the whole band can absorb it, and you just keep moving. That is totally different for me and doable. But if I had to sit and play some classical pieces from memory, even though I love it and I practice classical music all the time, and my aspiration when I retire is to be like Dave Ferris on the Forum. He's got like the life that looks amazing. He's like, I practice Chopin a couple hours a day on my Steinway D and get a bit of exercise, and then I work on jazz. That sounds great. I love playing that music, but I could never perform it for people outside of a casual setting. Have some friends over and play it for them, maybe. Yeah, I could do that with the music in front of me.
Yeah.
So that was, I haven't had as terrifying a experience since. You know,
that's a great example of an issue, performance issue that's guided your career and been a great learning experience. I think that's excellent. Now, speaking of careers in music, we also ask our guests to tag another keyboard player they'd love to hear spoken with on the podcast. Anyone that stands out to you that you'd love to hear more from?
Oh, have you had Jim on?
So Jim and I have toed and froed a few times. As you know, Jim is a very, very busy man. So for our listeners, this is Jim Alfredson, who plays in about 90 bands. I'm not exaggerating that much. So yes, one day it will happen, I'm sure.
Okay, Jim's great. Outside of our circle, there's so many people with interesting stories. You just got to find what's interesting about them, you know, but let them tell their story. Maybe there's a guy named Ric'key Pageot. He's
yes.
He was, you know who he is? He plays keys he's Madonna's keyboard
That's
player.
right. Yeah, Ricky and I've had a couple of emails as well, believe it or not, but it was a while back. So yeah, he's on the list. So good pick.
Yeah. Yeah, he's cool. I've played with him. I know him not that well, but well enough to recommend him. And gosh, man, in terms of keyboard players, it's amazing how few keyboard players I get to
No, that's good.
You know? Yeah, and then all of it, there's loads that I would recommend that you already know, you know, like people from the forum, you know.
Yeah, no, great. No, that's good. Thank you. And our other classic question, Bobby, is the Desert Island Disc. So 5 albums that have heavily influenced your life.
Okay, so they may not be my desert island, but they are definitely 5 albums that I would say were very formative to me. Okay, I'm glad that you told me about this ahead of time, so I had a bit of time to think about it, and I thought it would take me loads of time, but it was actually quite easy for me to scratch out 5. Okay, so in jazz, there's loads, but I would go with Miles Smiles, which is a Miles Davis album from, it's the second great quintet. It's mid 60s. And that's not because it's the best of those albums. It's because it's the first one that I bought. I was like 16 or 17, and I went to Tower Records, and I thought, Miles Davis is good, they say, and I should get an album. And then I would look at the back and say, oh, Herbie Hancock's cool. Yeah, I'll get the Miles album with Herbie on it. And I got that one. It happened to be the one that that I got, and I listened to it, and I was associated with many memories. I think it was a rainy day that day, and so I'm driving back from the mall in my car, and it's raining, and I remember how perfectly Miles's muted trumpet on a song Circles, I think, is the ballad on there. And I remember listening to that, and it was raining. I was like, this is perfect. And hearing harmonically what's going on, and the approach that Herbie used on that album, which is unlike, it was really unique. In that album, if you listen to Herbie's solos, it's a lot of no left hand. He's playing a lot of just right hand, and it's around the middle. It's around middle C and the octave below middle C and an octave or so above it. But it's a bit lower than you'd normally play as a jazz piano if you were comping with your left hand. So it's a unique sound. And I heard later that Miles told him to do that. Hey man, just leave your left hand out, play that. So, and there's some sophisticated ass things going on in that album. And what a cool diving off point for a piano player, a young pianist, into Miles Davis. That, and then of course Kind of Blue, which I'm not putting on this list, but I don't know which I got first. I think Smiles was the very first one. And I remember I took it up to that music store I worked at, and all of the musicians were like, damn, you picked a really good album. That was a good one to pick as your first foray into Miles. So that's a special one for me. All of the tunes on there and the playing, and of course Footprints is on there. That's probably the most famous song on that album. But Freedom Jazz Dance as well. So just some incredible playing on that album. Holds a special place in my heart. Let's see. Around the same time, this will resonate with you guys in Australia. The movie Shine came out in 1996. So the soundtrack to that movie changed my life, and the soundtrack to that movie, I would say, just because of the collection of songs that are on it. It's really the songs that he plays in that movie that all became instant classics to me. And I was like a semi-serious piano player at the time. That movie really made me think, oh my God, like I didn't know what a piano concerto was. And then he's playing Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. It's like, damn, how cool. And then he's playing that Chopin Polonaise to start the whole thing, where he's a kid. The movie starts off where he's, 7 in this local talent show, and he plays that badass Polonaise on that out of tune piano. He's playing it so hard that the piano starts scooting, and he has to scoot his bench towards the piano. And that piece, ever since then, I've loved that piece of music,
Yeah, David Hirschfelder is a monster player. He did a great job, let alone curating what went into the soundtrack.
Yes. And just the whole idea of a kid being able to play that piece. I couldn't even fathom at the time repertoire that complicated. I didn't know much about classical. I know a bit about classical composers, but I was not that familiar with their works. It's not like you just pull them up on Spotify. It was going through. And so that led to me going, it was a springboard for lots of stuff. I would go to the library and get loads of CDs of all of the music by these composers. I would get the music out at the library and try and play it and be like, Jesus, I can't play these nocturnes, like let alone these polonaises at the time, So that it was so formative for me, that album. So the music from that album was just, it meant so much to me. Headhunters by Herbie Hancock. It was actually the first version of Watermelon Man that I heard. It was not the Watermelon Man from his first album, Taken Off, but the Watermelon Man on Headhunters. it was just in high school when I got that album. And again, I think I just got lucky picking that album. Maybe I thought the cover was cool, but God, there's nothing I need to say about that album. It's like a masterpiece. Herbie's funky playing, the bits, the clav, the Rhodes, the voicings, the sound of the drums, the strings, the string machine. I love all of those ingredients and the way they came together. And that's a big influence on Cali Native, my album that I talked about. There's a song on Cali Native that's like dedicated to the sound of Headhunters, basically. The last tune on the record is called Watermelon Samples. So Watermelon Man, that's the Herbie part. Samples being Joe Sample. So there's a bit of Jazz Crusaders in it as well, because on my tune I wrote it for trombone and tenor sax, and that's the Jazz Crusader sound. But I always that mix of ingredients, that funky 70s sound. There's bass clarinet, but then so it's ethereal. There's orchestration, but then it's just badass Herbie Hancock at the center of it all, and it's funky. So I'm so fortunate that I got to listen to that album when I was in high school. And then let's see, is that 3 or 4?
That's 3.
That's
yeah.
3. Okay. Toto 4. It's just like a masterpiece. You know what? To be actually, if I was being truly honest, I would say the Toto album that I bought, that best of Toto album that I bought, even more than that Toto 4. That was this best of Toto album. That was an obscure one. They didn't even pull up when I put it in my iTunes at the time. It was just issued, I think, in Australia or in New Zealand where I bought it. But it had like all of the best songs from Toto 4 and then bits from, Toto, the 7th one, which is another really good Toto album with Joseph Williams. And just that's basically Toto's greatest hits. And so that is a desert island disc for me. All of those tunes formed so much about what I love about music, man. I mean, I could talk about Toto forever, but we already know what makes him great. I really enjoyed your Steve Porcaro interview. I just listened to it recently, like I said, and what a thrill to be able to just talk to that guy.
And he's such a nasty character too. He's very rude and grumpy. And he's one of the most approachable, lovely blokes you'd meet. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was so much fun.
Yeah.
It's like a living legend, and there's so much you can talk big picture stuff that you'd want to ask him, but then very small picture stuff. But then he's just volunteering these tidbits that you've never heard anywhere else. And you're like, holy crap, I can't believe he's just talking about this, It's really cool. So yeah, man, everything about Toto is a huge influence on me. And then also what I'd said earlier about them being the studio guys, being able to unleash like Porcaro can play drums on, freaking a disco album, and then he can go play on a rock album and do the perfect thing at the perfect time. I really wanted to cultivate that in my own playing. So yeah. And then also that album just sounds amazing, man. You spend your whole life just, sonically just basking in it. It's one of those albums you can put on if I'm driving back from a long gig or a crappy gig or something, or just it's a long night drive, maybe LA to San Diego after a hit in LA, and it's late, I'm getting tired. You can put that on, and sometimes you'll just really get that. It's like an injection it's like a drug almost. Like, oh, I'm feeling this, and you're drumming and swimming inside the music, and enjoying every aspect of it, from the playing to the way it sounds. Yeah. So that's a big one. And then the 5th one, it was tricky for me because there's loads of different albums, and I thought about being like interesting and picking something the more recent, because there's a bit of time when I got really into like electronica and dubstep and stuff, but I have to be honest, like I love the way a lot of those modern records sound, but when it's talking about a formative album for my playing, I ended up, this is kind of a strange one to say, but the Michael McDonald album, is it called If That's What It Takes? His first solo album.
Yeah, I know the one you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. It's got I Keep Forgetting on it. And those other tunes. Okay, so that album, it was around the same time I discovered Toto, and it was so loads of the Toto guys are on it, right? Jeff Porcaro. If I Keep Forgetting, it's Jeff Porcaro playing drums, and Phil and Gaines, and then Steve Lukather is on a bunch of it. And listening to what Greg Fillinganes played on keys on all of this stuff was like, I was listening to somebody play the perfect parts with perfect timing, and it was a real feast. But then also there was bits in the album where he was able to like, it wasn't just like the same thing over and over. Like he could comp a bit and play a really interesting blues tinged fill, or this really interesting pop fill, like a perfect Hornsby-esque, like just perfect 2.5 beat fill, you know? And so I did a lot of digging on that album and copying, and note for note, like there's a lot of things that he does there that it's the DNA of my playing, just because of when I listened to it in my time in my career as a player, on my development. Like it's his playing on that album is woven into the way I play, you know? So it's very formative for me. Even though it's amazing, that album, it's very like, it wasn't mastered that great. It's like if you put it on, you have to crank up the volume way more. And I think that since then, this is like, I think they've since reissued a lot of these albums that they didn't have as much maybe bass, or just they weren't as loud. That album's just not as loud. You have to crank it up. I think they've reissued them, a lot of them, where they're much louder now. So you don't end up having to just max it out. I would have to crank that thing up like as far as I could to hear it. But despite that, killer album.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much. Five great choices there, which we'll link to in our show notes. Now, as our final stanza to this, what's been a wonderful time talking to you, Bobby, we have our quick fire 10. So this is 10 questions that David and I are going to fire at you.
Oh my God.
Quick questions, quick answers. Let's see how we go. First one coming up right now, mono or stereo?
Oh. Stereo if you do it right.
Yeah, that's a good, it's a good response.
I can elaborate, but
no, that's okay. No, quick fire. That's good.
Yeah.
Sitting or standing when playing?
Damn, dude. It depends on the situation. Sitting is way more comfortable.
Depends.
I would say sitting.
Yeah, okay.
I've stood for a lot of gigs, but I think you play better when you're sitting down. The technique is way better when you're sitting. So I'd say sitting.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, sometimes standing's cool. Visual energy is standing is cool, you know? I don't know. If you can do both, you can do both, you know? But who has a rig? I want a rig that raises up and goes down and stuff, but I don't. So it's funny because I know it's rapid fire, but I've just transitioned to sitting down on a lot more of my top 40 gigs. I used to stand all the time and put loads of visual energy out. But watching myself on videos, it's funny. Sometimes if you don't have the right kind of visual energy as a performer, you can actually detract from what's going on. Even if you think you're moving around loads, it has to match the spirit of the tune, and it has to match what your real front people, your singers, are doing. So you can actually work against them if you look like a basket case over on the side. And there's certain songs where you have to, like, if a certain BPM, you have to decide, okay, am I going to dance half time to this or double time? There's a lot that goes into that. And I've studied quite a bit watching myself. But then I've also noticed, like, there's people who sit down who put out loads of visual energy by sitting down. And there's something that's like stoic about having your center, your visual center be down. Like David Paich looks badass sitting down at the piano, you know, but Steve Porcaro looks badass standing at it. So it depends on the situation. I said it depends, but if sitting is certainly more comfortable, and your energy level, like night after night, you'll save yourself a bit as you get older.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I agree with you on the technique too. I think it's a lot easier to play sitting, although I don't do it.
100%.
Yeah. Keytars, sexy or an abomination?
Yeah, it depends on the person doing it. I've never tried, and I don't think I can pull it off, but it depends, man. But I say if you're probably not, you know, if you're on the fence, then don't do it. But there's some people who can do a really good job. I used to think they were lame. They came back. I don't think it looks cool when Chick or Herbie does it. But Chick can sure play the hell out of it. But man, this Justin Timberlake concert that they did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, probably now, with Kevin Antunes, they had like 4 dudes dancing with the keytards, including Justin. That looked so badass. So I think if you're intentional with it, it can be cool. But I've never tried, and I'm afraid I'm going to look like a dork. So no for me.
Yeah, no, agreed. Transpose button or adjust on the fly, and you can't count the fact that your keyboard does it for you now. When you turn
it transpose button, no problem. I can play anything in any key. I can read loads of things, but sometimes it's just easier. Well, you just had a thread on this. It was Stevie Ray Vaughan's keyboard player, right? Do you remember this was on the forum recently? That guy was using a transpose button. Billy Joel uses one. Yeah. You're not using it because you're a weak musician. You're using it because there's a tactile sense to playing in certain keys. So, like, if you're trying to play in Stevie Wonder keys, if you're E flat minor, what's that tune? You haven't done nothing wrong. You can't do. There's the one Stevie Wonder tune that starts with this black key glyphs on the clav. Blam, 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 blam. Use your transpose button. Singers, guitar players who are going to play it in E minor, not E flat minor. What are you supposed to play? It's impossible. You've got to use your transpose button. There's good reasons to use a transpose button. Sometimes it's about conserving mental energy as well. There's nothing wrong with that.
Very cool. Yep, agreed. Favorite song that you've written?
I don't have a favorite. I like a lot of those and it's not all the notes that I wrote. It's the way the musicians interpreted them. You know, it's like, man, I like listening to the way the drummer played it, you know, or I like this guitar player, which I did not write that guitar part. I gave him a lead sheet and he came up with a badass guitar part. So that's my song, but he created the part. But I like listening to my album and hearing what all my friends did. But, you know, I guess, and I've written loads of different tunes and different styles, man. So it's hard to say. I've written commercial things for film and TV. I've done arrangements that I'm super proud of. But I'll keep it simple. All right. I'll pick one for my album. And I would say, just based on the tune, I'm really proud of the first song on that album, solely based on the actual melody. Like, if you took a real book chart of that tune, it's a cool tune, in my opinion. It's like, damn, if you reduce it beyond the performance of what happened on the actual album with the playing, you can just take the actual song, write the melody, write the chords. That song stands on its own. Somebody gave me a really good compliment. One of the trumpet players on my CD release, he said, man, that's like, sounds like it's straight out of the real book. And a few different people have told me that, and I've taken it as a good compliment, that it's a really cool composition in the jazz tradition that has enough interesting stuff happening that it's not derivative. It's a cool tune. Yeah. So yes, there you go. Good that pick. Song is called Master of Whispers.
Good pick. Even though I think you're lying to yourself, I think your favorite is Playing Freebird on the organ at the baseball, but we'll go with it. So that's fine.
I didn't write it. I don't get the royalties.
No, that's true. Yeah. Well, we don't know. You didn't write it. We'll choose to believe you did.
That's right. It was my dad.
Yeah. Last gig you attended as an audience member. Yeah.
I'll tell you this. I did go see symphony. I've got friends who play in the San Diego Symphony, and we have this very cool situation here where we have this gorgeous new venue downtown on the water. It's called the Rady Shell. It's a giant outdoor venue, like a Hollywood Bowl. And you can walk up to it during the day and listen to them rehearse. This past week, I took my kids, and we actually weren't going to listen because I didn't think it was a rehearsal day. It's just a cool place to walk. But sure enough, we get out, I open my car door, and I'm hearing Beethoven's Fifth. It was so cool. And I'm like, oh, man, got the stroller out, wheeled my kids up to the front, and I'm standing there looking up, peering above and looking at these musicians. They're Raphael Payar conducting. They're shedding parts of Beethoven's Fifth, and so that was me watching something. I was not attending a concert, but that was incredible. Okay, so I went on. It was a week ago. It was last Monday. A friend of mine had a big band concert, and it was his first one. He's a singer. He's a bit more of a like lounge singer, but he's very talented. This guy, and he has a big band he put together, and my friend Mike, our drummer from my Top 40 band, his name is Mike Holguin, and he's an incredible musician. He's one of the best reading drummers I've ever met, and he subs with the symphony sometimes, but he can read anything. And so he was subbing on the gig because the other guy got COVID. So Mike had to go play the show cold. They didn't really rehearse, but he had the charts. And so I went to support Mike and to support my friend Don, who was singing. So yes, I bought a ticket to that, and I went and watched the first half. I have to leave at halftime because I had to come home and deal with my kids. But it was a big deal for me to get out the door. It takes so much time to just go. The amount of energy you have to muster as a musician to go see someone else's concert. For me, it's especially with kids, it's almost insurmountable, sadly.
That's actually one of the toughest questions our guests have had to answer, to be honest. So you're not alone there, Bobby, for sure. What's the best thing about live gigs as a performer?
There's lots of things that are great, but if you can make somebody have a nice time, that's a very simple sense, enhancing somebody else's experience with something that's unique to you, your expertise. You can feel like a bit of a superhero. Like it's like, man, I can do something that not everybody can, and what I'm doing here, everyone else is liking. It's like that simple. If you can do that, that's maybe the best thing.
Yeah,
right. That's really what it boils down to.
No, good answer. And worst thing about live gigs?
Load out.
Yes.
Load in and load out is the worst. Yeah, it sucks. I hate load out so much. Load in is not fun either, but load in's better than load out, because load in, you've got anticipation, maybe a bit of a meal to look forward to, and there's that electricity of it, what's going to happen here. And but load out, even though you've already done your work, every second that you go slow at load out is a second you're missing from being home or being somewhere else. So you have to find the balance of not breaking down so fast that you look like a jackass and hurt yourself, but not taking too long. It could take me 45 minutes to load out if I took my sweet time, but I can load out in 8 minutes if I need to. But either way, it's like, what am I doing here? I want to be home. So load out is just, it sucks. I wish I had people who would do it for me. I wish I was on that level. Maybe one day.
What's one thing you'd like to see invented that would make your life easier as a keyboard player?
That's a cool question, man. And I've thought of a few things over the year, but nothing's coming to mind right now.
Robot roadies.
I can think of a few. A sustain pedal that doesn't break. They all break. They all break sometime. So it would be nice if they didn't. Robot roadies would be amazing. Yeah.
Or a keyboard that senses the key the band's playing and says, "Are you sure you want that transpose button on?"
Yeah. No, it's funny. I thought of that. Like eventually, I had that thought the other day of like AI would eventually make it so it's like it will ask you like, "Are you sure you want that? In that key?" Man, we have so much things that make our lives so much easier now that it's hard to think. But have they come out with the perfect board? No, there will never be the perfect keyboard. Is there? There's always a compromise. I love my Yamaha rig for what I'm able to do with it, but it's still like limited. I wish that there was a really robust way to have computers on stage. I think there probably is. I always find one reason I've resisted having a computer on stage is because my singer who's 2 feet away could just elbow my whole rig and I'm done. I'm toast. And so there's 10,000 little dongles and things hanging off. It would be cool if there was a slicker way. Now I know that there is, like there's guys on the forum who are like, "Hey, I've got it all in a rack and it's all like rock solid." I don't have that yet. But I don't know. I feel like the technology doesn't limit. I'm my own limit, not the technology.
Yeah, that's a good answer, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, So maybe a self-tuning piano would be nice. I don't know. Maybe some cheaper hammers. I have a great acoustic piano, but I would like it to like the hammer. It's an expensive mechanical beast.
That's right.
So
no,
I don't know, but
that's a good
just
one.
now, I don't know. And then short of that, maybe the next big thing, it seems like we're all recycling the same sounds now. Maybe it's time for something new. I don't know what that would be.
I'm hoping for a reboot of the Yamaha Electones myself, but we'll wait and see.
Yeah.
All right, sure, the last one, Bobby,
on that one.
Yeah. The last one is favorite non-musical activity or hobby. What do you do to wind down after all the music stuff?
I've got my family, which I love, and they take all my time. I've got a 1 and a 3-year-old, and so that's my life every minute. But besides that, being in my garden, my yard. It's something that's always, I guess, been with me. My grandparents had were farmers and things like that, but my mom was raised, like growing veggies in her back garden, which was much more common than it is now. Back then it was. But we live in California, and I happen to have married into a family. My wife's father owns the biggest California native plant nursery in the state, I think. I could be wrong. He's very much a very big person in the California native plant scene. And so it's kind of confusing, especially Australians may not know. Well, actually, take it back. You guys live in a Mediterranean climate, just like we do. So the type of vegetation that we have, you'll see loads of the wrong kinds of things planted in California. Palm trees. We only have one species of native palm, but you'll see loads of these non-native palms, very thirsty plants. We shouldn't have water-intensive plants here. We have a huge water crisis in California. My yard is all California native plants, and they're beautiful. It's not like dry, brown, tumbleweeds. It's not a desert. So anyway, my big passion is working on my yard. And I'm excited because our fall and our winter is approaching here. And that's the season when you get out in the yard and plant new things. It's the opposite of the way it works in other climates where it's like, the spring is when you do your planting, this and that. And then winter is like cold and there's nothing, everything's dead. It's the opposite here. Winter is when we get our rain, and that's when everything comes alive after their brutal summer. It's summer, everything's dormant. So in the fall and in the winter, I'm at my happiest because it's less hot and I get to be outside tending my native garden and planting new things. And put on a good podcast and spend all day in the yard, like under a cool sky. That is heaven for me.
That's good. And hopefully you get the rain, because we certainly had it down here. We've had where I am nearly 2.6 meters of rain in the past 6 months.
What?
Yeah. So anyway, we won't go on like I'm going to talk about the weather, but I'm not joking. So it's 2,600 mils. So I don't know what that is in inches, but it's a lot. Well,
that's like you're talking about 6 feet.
Yeah.
You've had 2 meters of rain is 6 feet of rain.
Yeah. Yep.
We usually get about 10 inches. If a lower than 10 inches makes you a desert, we'll get 10 to 12.
That's right.
But we're having a tough time. We've had 3 El Nino winters in a row, which means that we don't get.
And that's why we've got all the rain.
And that's why you've got all the rain.
Yeah.
And so they're saying it's not going to switch again this year, and so the wildfires get more and more out of control. I know this is not a planting podcast, but yeah, we could use some rain around here.
We cover everything. Bobby, it has been a wide-ranging discussion, and for that we thank you. It's been absolutely brilliant across the 2 parts of the show. We've really enjoyed it immensely, and you've shown just what a diverse player you are, and can't thank you enough.
It was so fun to get to talk about it, this and nerd out, and then realize, am I going too long about this? Oh, wait, no, this is what they want me to talk about.
Well, there you go, Paul. That was one wide-ranging discussion that I got a huge amount of value out of.
Oh man, that was such fun. And Bobby, now listeners, viewers, you've heard him. He's a really, really interesting guy. So generous with his thoughts, as all our guests have been. And there's some real passion around what he does, and that's probably the key thing I took out of our 2 parts talking to Bobby. Was he really gives all of himself to what he does. He's thinking about, how can I make this better? How can I make it fun? How can I make a great experience for my audience, whomever that may be? And I think we can all take a fair bit out of that for our own selves as performers. But yeah, I loved it. I really enjoyed it. Learned a lot too. Yeah,
absolutely. And now I'm desperate to watch a baseball game. So, and let alone see one of his other great gigs. So yeah, no, it was really, really valuable. Thank you, Bobby. You hugely appreciate your time. So a quick shout out to our gold and silver supporters as always, the Call Chrome user group. Thank you, Greg, on Facebook. So if you're on Facebook, definitely check that out if you're a Call Chrome user. Brother Paul Brown from the wonderful Water Boys. Brother Paul Brown is still out and about and playing all sorts of gigs, not just with the Water Boys, but we hugely thank him for his ongoing support, as do we Tammy Catcher of Tammy's Musical Stew, another great show out of Canada, and she's a huge supporter. And I should mention, I've neglected to do it so far, is as part of Pimp Our Band T-shirts, we have another Canadian band, says David, making sure the camera picks up his T-shirt, Shagwar. Look at that.
Jaguar. What do you think a shaguar is, David?
I
how
don't
would you
know.
describe a shaguar?
Being a parent-friendly podcast, I'm not sure I want to get into that, particularly from an Australian perspective. And I'm not saying that that's what their intention is, but I assume it's a bit like Shagadelic Baby, Austin Powers, with a Jaguar thrown in.
I thought it might be something to do with carpet, like a shag pole.
Oh, it could be that too. Good point. See, it's my dirty mind. I apologise.
Yeah, I don't know what you were thinking about.
So, for our Aussie listeners, and I think, our UK listeners will understand what I'm getting at. So, yes, appreciate you sending over the shirts, Tammy and Shaguar, and we'll be linking to you guys in the show notes as well. So, we'll be back again in a fortnight or so, but just a reminder, you can keep in touch via a few means, www.keyboardchronicles.com. Just another quick reminder, we have a lovely range of about 90 pieces now of merchandise, wall art, T-shirts, you name it. You want a shower curtain with a keyboard motif on it and something different? Oh, we're your people, and we're even throwing a set of steak knives, except that's one thing we don't have.
Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want a keyboard shower curtain?
I know. Well, if I didn't have a fixed shower like glass thing, I'd totally be buying one. But sadly, I can't put a curtain over what's already there. My wife would kill me. So we're on Facebook at facebook.com Keyboard Chronicles, Twitter at the Keyboard CHR1, number 1. If you like good old-fashioned email, we'd love to hear from you at editor@keyboardchronicles.com. Last shout out for Patreon, patreon.com/Keyboard Chronicles. Really appreciate the people, as I've already mentioned at the end of the show, who do support us in that way. Paul, couldn't have done it without you, sir, as always.
David, it's been a pleasure as always. I've had a really great time once again with you chatting to Bobby.
And most importantly, thanks you all out there for listening, and we will definitely see you back in a couple of weeks.
Da, da, da.